Welcome everyone to today's webinar, a look into development from concept to prototype to actualization. My name is Nitin Puri. I'm a senior product manager at Envision, and I'm going to be moderating our session today. We'll go through some prepared questions and have some time for your questions at the end, so please drop them into the questions section throughout the discussion. I'm joined today by three fantastic panelists from Envision and LaunchDarkly. And we're going to be talking a little bit about how we organize ourselves and get work done with cross-functional teams. So before we dive into the content we have, I'll introduce these fine folks and let them tell you a little bit about what they work on. So first off, we have Cameron Savage, who's a principal product manager at LaunchDarkly. Cameron, you want to tell folks a little bit about what you work on?
Yep. Hey everyone. I run up 2 squads at LaunchDarkly. Previously, I've done the same at Atlassian and a couple other places as well. I work closely with Vikram here, who you'll hear about a bit in a second. But I've been at LaunchDarkly about 1.5 years, helping to drive forward some of our kind of application and service-oriented progress that you might use yourself.
Awesome. Next up, we've got Vikram Rojo, who is a design lead at LaunchDarkly. Vikram?
Yeah, as Cameron mentioned, we work together, mostly in the application experience and evolving our product as sort of our customer needs grow. So I work with Cameron to research and get solutions in place for our team.
And last but not least, Edith, who is an engineering manager at Envision.
Hi everyone, my name is Edith, and I work with Nitin at Envision. I'm the engineering manager for 2 teams, authentications and account management. Before Envision, I worked at a company called New Relic. Also follow very similar organization structure when it comes to delivering products.
Awesome. Thank you guys all for being here. So let's dive in. First things first, let's talk a little bit about how the product delivery teams are organized at both LaunchDarkly and Envision. What's that shape of the organization? Cameron, maybe you can kick us off with LaunchDarkly.
Yeah, sure. So at LaunchDarkly, we've organized ourselves into squads, something that many people often hear about as the kind of Spotify model. It's our own bespoke version, as most people do. Where we're focused on kind of initiative-oriented kind of prioritization and ownership, so that any independent group of individuals working together kind of own and iterate and refine towards a set goal that they kind of own and build their own expertise around. I think that that's also particularly helpful when it comes to prototyping something from early stages on through, because you have a lot of shared awareness and context, and also you work really closely with each member of your team to kind of like refine and iterate and cycle through that as you try to get something into the right place. So it means like Vikram and myself and our engineering lead are kind of in constant discussion.
Awesome. Vikram, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think from a design perspective, I've worked in different configurations with teams, either sort of the agency model where a designer is just called in to sort of support a group, or kind of a design silo often, which is they are kind of leading initiatives themselves. And our current iteration at LaunchDarkly is, as Cameron mentioned, the squad. I'll add to that, we're constantly evolving our process, and along the lines of the shared context, one of the ways we're thinking about it now is sort of this dual track where we have a discovery track and a delivery track. And that kind of just helps us have 2 different aims for the different parts of the product process. In the delivery track, we bring a wider set of stakeholders in that may or may not be in the delivery portion of that feature. And that honestly just helps us be wrong more often and test out ideas without being too attached. And then we kind of harden that with a sort of smaller group of folks just focused on getting it out to production or our staging or test environments. And yeah, so I think that dual track really sort of helps us put different goals for different sort of fidelities of our solution.
Yeah, definitely. We'll definitely want to dive into some more on that discovery in a couple minutes as well. Edith, do you want to share a little bit about how InVision organizes its product delivery team?
Sure, very similar to what LaunchDarkly is doing. I guess the Spotify model pretty much spread all over the world at this point. We also have the squad model. Within a squad, the squad itself owns end-to-end of a specific product area. From all the way from ideation to the actual operation of the software, the team owns it. So in both of my squads, we have our EPD trio, and we also embedded a security engineer into our team because authentication is the front door of our SaaS platform, and security is important. I know that in some other squad, they may have like different variation other than just the EPD. Like, for example, I know that some squad embedded a QA into their squad, but the whole idea is to have one squad have an individual unit can actually make its own decision and ship out the product, ship out the features that relate to the product area of the squad.
Yeah, definitely.
I had a question on that too. I've been thinking about it a bit. So everyone, a lot of people follow the EPD model, which for folks that aren't aware, it's engineering, product, and design. Edith, do you find yourself bringing in other specialties to support that EPD ever? There's one case that comes to mind, but I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, like I said, we bring in a security engineer. That security engineer actually belongs to a different team, more like a horizontal, belong to a group called AppSec, which is responsible for application security across the whole platform. But this security person is our representative into the AppSec. So this person will be responsible for help us to hack out code and try to do code auditing, make sure that we are not violating any security best practice. I know that in some of our squads, it would embed, like, let's say, a data science person to help with the data analytic aspect of our of whatever product area that they're working on. And like I mentioned, in some cases, we actually embed a QA in some other product area as well.
I've also worked in places where product marketing is closely synced as well to help with kind of the go-to-market planning and the kind of positioning of what you're trying to do and prioritizing how the story comes to life.
So it'd be like EPD, DM as well, something like that.
EPD and
Well, the whole idea is you want to bring in a group of people, get together, they have the autonomy to make decision and get the product out fast to the users. Whatever specialties or expert that we need, we'll find a way to get the person into the squad and help out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Vikram.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think along data analytics, which is something we find ourselves needing, we're also trying to think of an experimentation lens. And so I think, especially given our platform, trying to have that lens from early on, like what are we trying to test in our product development? So I'm just really curious about these additional roles that can support the EPD structure.
The final addition to that, often we find documentation being a critical contributor in that session as well. So like the earlier documentation comes in, the better your documentation is. Depending on your product, that can be a critical lifeline for how people orient and understand your product. That's more or less valuable depending on the type, but for ourselves, where you're doing some pretty significant integration into your tech stack, that's part and parcel of the product experience itself.
Yeah, definitely. So we started to touch on this a little bit. Sounds like both companies are organized pretty similarly, and you guys started to allude to some of this, but I'm curious to hear from each of you what you feel like is most beneficial about this squad format. Edith, I'll start with you this time.
Well, I think the most beneficial thing about the squad model is we bring all the right folks together in the room at the same time to solve a specific problem. Especially in Envision, we are a 100% remote company. So I don't run into people in the hallway or by the coffee pot. Every meeting is intentional. We have to set up time and get a group of people together, and we have to make use of that time effectively when everybody is in the room. And also, as a people manager, I think having a squad model is a great way to build great teams because there'll be stronger bond, they work better and closer together.
Yeah. Vikram, anything from the design point of view? I'm curious, what's particularly valuable for your function about organizing this way?
Yeah, I think integrating design into just product development has or can be challenging. I think bringing designers to the table early as well as developers, bring them both together is really hard, but having a squad relationship build over time makes that a lot easier. So it's that collaboration just like grows over time. You feel really comfortable bringing folks into conversations earlier. There's less of that sort of handoff mindset where you work in a silo, you hand off a design spec to someone, they have a bunch of questions that come back. That seems a lot more fluid. Communication is a lot easier around that. Trying to think.
Yeah, would you say like the long-term benefits really pay dividends? Like, you know, the relationships you build, the shared context you kind of gather. I think that's been my experience. Cameron,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think there's just, the playground is just like bigger for folks to play, and it's not that developers stay in their lane, designers stay in their lane. We find, you know, we rely less on super high fidelity mockups early on. And in that way, like developers are constantly contributing to the fidelity and knowledge, like fidelity and experience of a product, along with designers. So some of those barriers, I think, some of those barriers are lowered when all sort of functions feel a shared responsibility for the ultimate outcome of a feature.
Yeah, totally. Cameron, anything you'd add? I see you nodding over there.
Yeah, no, I think that the idea that there's no barriers between kind of disciplines, if you would, I think is the crux of that. And like the long-term dividends that pay off are the familiarity and like the kind of like working practices that teams develop together. But I think that where that really starts to shine is in some of like the practices that everyone I think is trying to figure out these days, which is how do you arrive at a better conclusion faster? How do you prototype more effectively? How do you deliver more efficiently? How do you make sure that you're impacting your goals more confidently? And when you have a team that's on the same page and working together and iterating together, then like what Vikram said is you start working with the team earlier in the design process. It's lower fidelity. You might, this is not groundbreaking, but you might start at whiteboarding and sketches, but like you start to get into, okay, well, how do we build clickable prototypes together with each other? And that is your spec oftentimes. And then how do you then take that and actually live prototype that in code? And like the longer time between a handoff, the more kind of investment that is wasted, but also like the less alignment you have. And so it's like by narrowing that window, you're kind of cycling through that more and more swiftly. And even if, like I think Vikram said this earlier, like you're wrong faster, you're wrong more often, but you're actually right sooner. Is I think what it's a little bit of an adjustment period, because you kind of waterfall it out a little bit, then you feel like you're right more often, but you're right slower. So like by bringing everyone together in that sense, I think that the process starts to kind of like really accelerate itself and kind of amplify the outcomes in a way that, you can bake processes and actions such as, using Envision or LaunchDarkly or whatever tools you're using to kind of amplify your prototyping, your release processes, your experimentation practices, and so on.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's test out a more specific example here. So let's say you, as a squad, have zeroed in on an opportunity. How do you kick off as a cross-functional group? And what is each role bringing to the table? Vikram, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, so our squad picks up a lot of small to medium-sized initiatives. We kind of support the ongoing application development. So I can speak about this, like, because we kick off projects fairly often. Most recently, I think, again, because of sort of our squad and how we have this, we try to build a shared context for problems. I often find myself going to customer notes that the PMs had sort of, like Cameron and our other PMs have combed through to help give context and kind of paint a picture of what our sandbox is. So what is the scope of this project that we're playing in? And from there, the leads, so our engineering lead, Alexei, Cameron, and myself will, again, try to paint this picture of how big is this project really, what is the key impact from it, and what are the areas we should focus on. And kind of that gives me a good sense of how to structure early brainstorming and sort of whiteboarding and wireframing sessions with the rest of the team. So there's this like really early convergence of like, okay, this is the scope of the project. And from there, we sort of diverge. We go a bunch of different paths. We often end up at a matrix of solutions, which honestly is really different from how I first started off my career, where you're always driving towards a single solution, whether or not that solution is applicable. It's always you're going for high fidelity. And nowadays we're sort of like, okay, I'm going to give 5 solutions, and 4 of them will be wrong, and that's just the context and the sort of thought experiments we're trying to build as we kick off the discovery project.
And the definition of wrong is, it could be for a myriad of reasons: feasibility, user impact, strategic influences, and so on. That's been interesting.
Yeah.
It remind me of similar things that we have in Envision. We call it bad versions. There are 5 bad versions. Eventually, we'll come to a good one.
And yeah, I'll say also it may be wrong for this moment, but we'll look back. Like Cameron and I have looked back 6 months or a year and be like, oh, this feature snuck its way into some other product we were developing. So when I say wrong, I think I just mean, sorry, it's just not the ideal, right? It's not the ideal solution for this team in this moment.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it can be overstated how valuable it is to have engineers looped in early in discovery. I personally, Edith and I have avoided major pitfalls, and it kind of helps disqualify some options really quickly up front, helps you refine your thinking about like unhappy paths and things like that. So, but I think having engineers involved early in discovery has historically been a little bit of a controversial topic. So even though there's like a lot written out there about the benefits, I think it's hard for some teams who aren't doing that today to understand how they can do that and continue to deliver. Edith, I think you had some thoughts along this line previously. Maybe you can speak a bit to how we balance making executional progress and still having engineers looped into discovery.
Absolutely. Nitin and I worked together for a long period of time now. So he knew my thought, my thinking process behind the when is a good time to loop in the engineers. So just to give you a little context, before I joined Envision, I worked on some other products, and I often thought that engineers should not get involved too early because engineers are expensive, and besides the product development aspect, engineers also responsible for operations. So in the past, I kind of thought that, well, we're going to loop in engineers when the design is ready, and that's when the engineers can start the execution. Boy, was I wrong, because engineers can actually help inform the design at the very beginning of the process. So for give you an example, for one of the teams that are managing authentication, a lot of time the technical flow actually dictates or give precedent of the design. So if you can imagine a single sign-on type of situation or multi-factor authentication situation, the technical flow pretty much govern or guide the user experience. So it's a lot more beneficial to have engineers to get involved early on during the ideation process, so that the engineers can get to work with the designer and say, well, the design looks fantastic, but realistically, the technical side, this is the flow and this is how it works. Or there are times that the engineers actually can get involved and say, if we get a little bit low fidelity type of design, we can actually have the product go to market a lot faster than the original design the designer is thinking. So there's a little bit of negotiation even at the beginning of the kickoff of the discovery process, and I find it tremendously helpful to have the engineers to get involved. We have this concept called epic lead. Typically, we would assign one person to help out with the designers during very early stage of the ideation or the designing process. And then the rest of the team will keep on executing a feature that's already in flight and also responsible for the operation. So this is how I am balancing between having engineers to get involved early while also having the engineers to focus on the current development and operation of the features.
We use a similar concept to the Epic lead. We call them feature leads. In my time at Atlassian, we also did similarly on the product that I worked on there. It's a pretty powerful tool for a number of reasons. As you mentioned, like you designate an owner who has like specific tactical expertise about how something's going to be executed. You have like an opportunity to like learn new skills for individuals on the team as well. You're kind of cultivating new skills and up-leveling people, giving them opportunity for growth. But also I think that like outside of the tactical benefits of like getting back to like be right sooner, like feasibility stuff sooner, so you don't diverge and then have to come back. It's very expensive. I think that there's also you're working closely with these people on this product every day. And if say the four of us are in the room together, like regardless of our specific roles and what we empirically bring to the table, I think that like I don't know, I might have the best idea 25% of the time if on a good day out of the four of us, right? And I think that the number of times that one of our engineering team members has brought a fantastic idea that we hadn't even considered that got us to our goal faster and better, and just like it was a genius, is extremely frequent. So bringing more people to the table, it's the same reason why you talk to your customers. You bring other perspectives. So your team has a lot to offer, both to like maybe you thought about this for 2 weeks and you bring it to them then, and you're so in it that you're missing something obvious and they point it out for you, or they're part of the discovery and just bring valuable input. I think that can't be overvalued, even if it's like the soft aspect. And like kind of what Edith mentioned, like there is a such thing as a too soon in any process for any role type, or a too late. And you just have to like think about what the benefits are and work with the team to kind of figure out how is the best time to allocate their everyone's time. but like make that an open conversation about the most kind of efficient and effective way to utilize everyone.
I'll add to that too. A lot of product development is about trade-offs. Ultimately you have a fixed size team, you have a fixed budget. There's only so much your software stack can do. When you are developing solutions, you really have to sort of get a whole map of the trade-offs that are involved. Like, what if we do this, what can we not do? That's often how I think about our projects. So even if we start really broadly during discovery, you very quickly find out what would cost too much if you bring developers into that process. On the flip side of that, as software development, gets more complex, like you talked about security, Edith, and there are some solutions that are very developer driven. There is occasionally the time when we don't bring design in early enough because it's conceived as like an off-the-shelf solution, and I think that's also another challenge that we keep an eye on. So we're also not saying, hey, well, this is a known solution. We don't need to sort of brainstorm or do some discovery on it because it's an integration, for example.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it's not just about making sure engineers are looped in early, but the flip side as well, for sure. It's about shared understanding and shared ownership. Awesome. So we've talked a little bit about this discovery process, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your process as the initiative actually starts to take shape. How do you move through phases like prototyping and eventually releasing something? Cameron, Vikram, I'd love to hear from the LaunchDarkly side.
Yeah, like Cameron and I've been talking about, we intentionally start off pretty low fidelity, wire sketches, just low fidelity UI mockups that we can share with as many folks as possible, and we intentionally try to keep it static and broad, and as few sort of interactions and screens as possible, and kind of in a way that forces us to talk a lot about our solutions and sort of document and write notes around it much more than sort of focus on the interface or the visual appearance itself. Up until we get to, say, just larger buy-in. The squad is more bought into a solution, sort of organization is possibly bought into a solution. And when we feel that, then we sort of move into high fidelity prototypes, like clickable prototypes, and accounting for all the states that needs to be taken in. As an anecdote, there's something that I hear mentioned at LaunchDarkly quite a bit, which is the quickest way to start a conversation is to put a bad solution forward, and then everyone starts talking about it. Then they just sort of pile in.
Yeah, 100% can relate to that.
Yeah, for sure. I think too that like that's where like your confidence level and your audience, the relationship between those two is really important, right? Like people dogpiling on something too soon is only unproductive. So a practice that we're still refining over time, but it actually kind of mirrors the way that LaunchDarkly operates, and that like you can choose your target audience as you roll something out, is like we utilize that internally and for our team. So like we think about that from like first the triad talks. It's like, hey, what are we even trying to accomplish here? What are the opportunities? What are the goals at broad strokes, right? And then we start to get into maybe the squad, and we're like talking through potential solutions and potential outcomes, and maybe we go to like our immediate leads. Like I work closely with our head of product and head of design. Like we open the realm just a little bit to like circle and build confidence. And then, that's all in design. That's all in, clickable prototypes, sketches, and so on, right? By the time we get to something that is like higher fidelity, it's like, okay, maybe it's time to go to like our triad leads, and maybe we're getting into development. So we kick into development and we make something live, live code for only our squad. So only our squad sees it because it's still refining, but we wanted to see it as soon as possible. It's still buggy, it's still incomplete, but like no one else shares that same context that our squad does. They're like, if someone else saw it, they go, well, why would you do that? Like, or I can't believe that this is, what you're thinking about shipping. Well, we're not, but we're finding things sooner. We're finding interactions. We're seeing live data. And then once it gets to a certain point, then you say, okay, rest of team, internal. It's like now it's for dog fooding or cat fooding, as we call it, because of whatever, all sorts of reasons. But now we're in internal dog fooding where we, everyone feels it, everyone gives notes, we blitz, which is basically just like everyone jumps in and gives us bugs or UX feedback, right? And confidence is building, and then that's the point where you say, okay, beta users, target users, and then maybe all the way to 100% of all customers, right? And so within that flow, we use design prototyping, production code prototyping using feature flags and so on. But all of it comes back to a single principle, which is as your confidence grows, your audience grows, and as the audience grows, it builds your confidence, and so on. And like that practice and that process I can't, like, if there's one thing that I would carry into anywhere I go, it's that process. And having the right tools to enable that is critical, of course, but and maybe that's not groundbreaking, but I think that tools these days are much better at making that happen. So if you really lean into that, then it's extremely impactful on building trust for your team and building trust in your outcomes and really validating what you're building.
Yeah, definitely. Edith, anything to add from the Envision perspective?
Yeah, so very similar to the LaunchDarkly model too. We're trying to like snowball into something higher fidelity, much better user experience to our end users. So typically we follow an agile methodology like many other companies. The sweet spot for us is we always try to find a way to break down our project such that we deliver the thinnest vertical strip of a product feature out to production. And we use tool like LaunchDarkly to help us to determine is this feature good enough for our alpha customer or good enough to do a scheduled rollout. Within that tiny strip of functionality that we deliver, we get much faster feedback loop from our designer, from our engineering, from our product manager, and then we'll use that feedback, go back and refine and incrementally deliver more and more and enrich the user experience that way. And another thing, as an engineering manager, I have to bring out this. We also have something called definition of done, which is something that guide engineers through the process from ideation to production-ready software. When we say something is done, we're talking about not just only code complete, not just only designs complete. We also talk about, have we thought about monitoring? Do we have enough documentation? Do you know who's going to be the domain expert to answer questions? So the definition is a tool for us to ensure quality. Yeah, that's all I have to add on.
Yeah, great. So last question from me, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So all of this sounds amazing, the autonomy from a hypothetical standpoint, but there have to be limitations. What doesn't always work so well, and where are the gaps in that process that people who are listening today should be prepared to make some exceptions? I'd love to hear from each of you. And Vikram, I'm gonna kick off with you.
Yeah, so we've talked quite a bit about squads and the shared context that the team builds and trust. And that works so long as you can assign a problem to a single squad. And it's a little bit harder to understand ownership and sort of roles and contributions when the sort of problem is much bigger than a single squad. So it like involves some backend, some service updates, as well as like multiple parts the front end. It's like, i.e., a much larger workflow than just a single sort of a single screen or a couple of screen solutions. So that's probably one of the bigger gaps to watch out for, and something that I think we're trying to overcome and bring the same sort of benefits of squad, but make it work for cross squad initiatives.
Yeah. Edith, anything you want to share? Challenges you've seen with this model?
Yeah, silos is definitely one problem when you have a group of people so focused on one specific product area, they're bound to have gap. Vikram went over it already. Another challenge that I see with the squad model is that because each of the team has the authority to decide how a feature is supposed to be implemented, I found that there are situations where similar sub feature will kind of creep up in different squads. Engineering wise, is eventually it's going to be a nightmare because everybody try to solve a similar problem in slightly different way, with worse yet, different naming technology, different way of naming the same thing. This is something that needs to be addressed and to deal with at above the squad level.
Yeah, I can say that's not only an engineering problem, that is also a product and design problem where you have 3 different ways to solve a very similar problem across your disparate products, for sure. Cameron, anything to add to what Vikram and Edith shared?
Yeah, I think that the problem that y'all were just calling out is one of the challenges of creating the right goals and objectives. If you have this siloing, then the fact that there are teams colliding on the same outcomes means that the targets for those groups have not been well defined. And I'm not saying that like at y'all, I've had the same problem before as well, right? And so like I think that the only way to remedy that is consistent and constant cross communication across any silo boundaries. But the converse of that is you had silo boundaries between technology stacks if you divide it by technology, which is how many of people do your back end, iOS, Android, web, design, all working in separate pods. Like then you start competing over resources and not communicating priorities between those boundaries, right? Where everyone has their own sets of priorities. So I don't think that problem is new. It's just a different orientation. I think that like being really clear about what your objectives are and making sure that those all kind of like fit together as a company puzzle, where your company strategy is still cohesive. You can't fragment your team across multiple squads necessarily to help resolve any potential collisions, because like that's just not an efficient use of your time and effort. And I think some other people worry about like flexibility, where it's like, oh, I don't want to be stuck on that initiative or with these people. And so there's ways that you can have to think creatively about one, pitching that by having autonomy and ownership and such, that you have career opportunity to be more closer to the decision making for that initiative, but also thinking about like how do you one of the tactics we use is every quarter or so people are encouraged to move between squads and initiatives, because not only does it give you an outlet to go refresh your brain, work on something new, but also cross-pollinates great practices that you've learned in one context that might make sense in another context. And it's just, you learn new ways of operating, you get better over time, provided your culture supports it. So I think that, kind of like pitching the value and the trade-offs is important to acknowledge the pros and cons.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, that is all the questions that I had today. Thank you all for answering all my questions. I think we're going to open it up now to audience questions. So if you haven't already, if you have a question, please submit it into the question section of the webinar. All right, so our first question here is, how do you use data to help set the scene or guardrails for new initiatives?
I'm going to jump on that because I feel like as a PM, it's required of us. I think that it depends on the type of data and where you are in a project, right? So, your first data might start with general product performance or customer anecdotal data or research data. That's going to inform either at the macro level, the direction you're trying to go as an initiative or as a company, or even at the kind of more micro level where you're targeted at a specific opportunity, a problem, or maybe a goal that you're trying to accomplish. And so those are going to be what feeds into like your decision-making system. That kind of orients how we're going down which path. But once you get into that, then it starts to become a little bit more case by case basis, depending on the type of work. But like you start looking at performance metrics, either like user performance metrics or technology performance metrics. You might be looking at validation via user research. So that's where it starts to broaden out immediately, where PM's kind of framing where we're going along with the triad. But then there's what you're trying to accomplish can be informed by things that the engineering team might own and lead, or the design team might own and lead.
Yeah, I would add like it's a super important aspect of that kickoff step, right? Like you have an opportunity to frame all the different dimensions of the initiative for this cross-functional team, and big part of that is telling the story around the problem or the opportunity that you have. But another big part is defining success and what are the KPIs that we're actually trying to move. And I think that can be a really focusing element of the sort of kickoff. We could talk in big vision ways around what we're trying to solve for, but the KPIs can help you hone in and evaluate options and say, like, is this going to move this KPI or is it not? And it's a lot more black and white.
I'll add to that. When we look at customer research, it's just not specific. Like rarely is there a customer solution that points to a very specific, or a customer problem that points to like a very specific solution or a way of implementing things. And so we're sort of always fishing for data to support one approach or another.
You're back.
Uh-oh, I think we lost Vikram for a sec.
Well, maybe I can jump in and talk about on the engineering side how we use data as a guardrail for any new initiatives. Another one of my team, the account management team, typically we have pretty heavy traffic going through our services because account users, these are fundamental blocks of services within our ecosystem. So to safeguard our services, typically we look at the data from our monitoring tools, take a look at the traffic pattern, what is the against our current SLOs, whether or not this new initiative for this particular new initiative, what is the expected traffic pattern, and how is it going to fit into the ecosystem when it goes to production. So we use existing data of our traffic pattern to inform us how much effort we need to put into scaling and tuning our new services.
Yeah. I think that I'll be remiss if I don't shamelessly plug LaunchDarkly as part of our process here as well, where it's like we use data to inform how we roll things out. Where we're introducing something, we basically run experiments on whether it's performance related or like customer impact related, where you'll roll a new feature out to 5% of your users, and we will reach out to those groups of users and ask them feedback, or we'll watch the metrics that we're measuring for the differences. We'll run an experiment to see comparative lift, and then use that to inform a decision whether we think that despite all of our thinking and all of our validation, nothing really is real until it's live in production fully. So like, we'll dip our toe in the water and validate, and then make the decision whether or not it's time to like continue rolling that out, or if we make refinements before rolling it out further. And we do that for infrastructure migrations. We do that for new dashboard UI, launching new features and capabilities. But that's another way that we set kind of going back to success metrics, but also guardrails on how and when something kind of moves forward.
Next question we have here is, are these squads permanent or are they temporary for specific projects?
I can start. Great question. So in Envision, we actually have both. Squads with permanent model. To give you an idea, authentication, for example, one of my teams, it's a niche area. It's hard for us to just swap engineers in and out, because in order to perform those to develop those features, we take time to train our engineers to accumulate the background and the technical knowledge. We also have something we call them tiger teams. So these are not permanent squads. This team are formed for a specific purpose, for a specific duration, focus on one task. Yeah. So Cameron, I'm just curious. In your organization, do you have like both squad, permanent and non-permanent approach?
Sort of. Right now, basically, we consider them long-term, whereas like they're not permanent, but right now at least we're small enough in size that we're only just now talking about our first Tiger team, basically. And that's like application front-end performance oriented, which is niche and owner, kind of like cross-functional, basically. But the way we think about our squad focus is like, one, you don't want to change them so frequently that you lose what we talk about as the benefits of the long-term working together, the patterns and the practices. But also, like we think that if in order to say that someone should spend all their time on something, that it needs to be important enough long-term to be like something that you're trying to accomplish. So like maybe that's a type that you can finish, like deliver a certain type of experience over time. Maybe it gets to the point where you have diminishing returns and it's okay, now put those talented team members on something else. But that should be, probably a year or so's length at minimum, typically, but we're not locked into, you're not stuck. So that's why we think of them as long-term, but we're trying to keep them, a financial year planning terminology level of objectives and key results that we're after. I think once we got bigger, like in my time at Atlassian, you had a little bit more like the permanent and the temporary focus, like authentication and design systems and things like that. Those were long-running, just everyone worked on that full-time, and then there were kind of like cross-cutting initiatives that were like, make this happen across these teams. You're the owners to bridge those gaps. That was kind of like the Tiger team approach. At LaunchDarkly, we're in the situation where we have, I think, 4 or 5 squads really, and each of them have a domain ownership, and we've set our goals pretty long-term so that we can remain stable and like slowly grow through hiring to add more squads over time.
Awesome. So I think this is probably the last question we have time for. When working in a squad, do you think product managers should write all user stories, or do you think there are times when it may make sense for the designer to write the stories? Yeah, I see Cameron shaking his head. Probably echo that sentiment. Vikram, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the takeaway from a lot of these conversations is the wisdom of crowds is one part. Our stories come from a lot of different places, and honestly, the final spec, it's a little bit of the engineer defining the milestones and the specific stories that will be approached in this specific iteration of a project. But those initial stories come from so many places. They come from customer stories. They come from Cameron, it comes from product manager, and they come from all the engineers that sit in during discovery, and designers as well. Like we also write, we also contribute stories. Sometimes we do story mapping where everyone is just writing these jobs to be done stories. And I think I'll just add to that I think it's a good practice for every role to write well-constructed stories. So include a scenario, include what the intent of the user is, and what they hope to get out of something. I think that's a practice that in our triad we try to get everyone to do. So engineers, PMs, designers alike.
Yeah, that's also something that speaking of like writing well-defined stories, we also have been working on our support and sales and customer success group on that front as well, where oftentimes they're talking to the customer as much or more than product managers or designers. Talk about a resource of someone who really understands our product in a unique and powerful way. So they are a massive source of our feedback requests that go into our feedback system. And aggregate those and to help us prioritize. And we've been working with them on like, hey, give us better context. Don't just like cut and paste an email thread, for example. Don't take the user verbatim. Like, you have a lot of context of what they're asking for. They're asking for a solution, but what is the problem they're trying to solve? Like, this, help us remember to add that in, because you might forget over time. So like I think that like it is like the responsibility of the product manager role to help frame the problem and the outcomes you're trying to accomplish. But like we talked about, I really like that term, the wisdom of crowds, like the wisdom of your team as the way to realize that is I think that is more where like stories, that's the fidelity or the altitude in which stories come in. They're a little bit more executional. And I think that is owned by everyone in the collaboration cycles that come after what it is we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to accomplish it.
Yeah, definitely. Edith, anything to add on to that?
I was actually going to pass the mic to you, because this is a product-related question. How about you? How about you answer the question for us?
Sure. I was just gonna add that yeah, for us, interestingly enough, I think our engineers write a lot of the ultimate user stories that get executed on. Like, if you have that shared context, I think the high level user story around like what a user is trying to accomplish is like you said, Cameron, a tool for framing the discussion early on. But once you get into the level of like, okay, these are the milestones that we're going to be able to execute, and this is the right sequencing, I think we try and make sure that our engineering lead on the project has enough of that context around what the user's goals are, that they can frame a lot of those. So when it comes to writing user stories or creating, the Jira tickets around that, that's something we lean on our engineers for.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is lately our process with our team has like the stories almost don't exist. It's like we have a product spec that is like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? What does it look like? How do we define success? And then effectively there's a clickable prototype of the outcome of all of our conversations. And then a tech spec where it's like, the development team goes off and defines like, what is the shape of the architecture? What are the requirements? What prerequisites? What dependencies? And so on. But like that is the maximum output we typically have. And then the whatever, I don't care what shape your tickets in the task tracker to take, personally speaking, right? Like, I don't think that our engineering managers don't care, because it's like whatever is best for your personal or your team structure or the shape of the project. Like those are actually just like, they're just like the way that you want to build this thing. As long as we estimate clearly and set our milestones well, like the headline of what you will deliver and be able to demo on Monday, we do weekly demos basically to show progress and awareness for the team. But like that's the level of fidelity that we care about. So it's like, what are we doing? Why are we, why? What's the prototype outcome look like? And what week will we see which versions of that along the way? It's all iterative delivery and less bookkeeping and more doing. It's been an interesting experience. So like, I'd come from places where it's a little bit more oriented around making sure you write well-crafted tickets and so on. And it introduces a little bit of potential, it's easy to get off track, but it's also more time to get back on track and keep going as well. So thus far, it's worked well for us.
Awesome. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you, Cameron, Edith, Vikram, again, for sharing more about how your product organizations work. I think we're going to be packaging up this webinar recording and sharing it out with all attendees by email. And if you do find yourself with questions about either LaunchDarkly or Envision, you can reach out to us at launchdarkly.com or envisionapp.com. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.